You can spend lots of time going on YouTube, reading people's blogs, even listening to podcasts like this. But if you can find someone you trust and you understand what they're teaching, they can save you time if you just follow them, if you dive into what they're looking at teaching you. That's why we put together pillarsofpractice.com, a totally free e-course to help you, whether you're a solo practitioner or a group practitioner, to get the basic checklists and trainings that you need to rock out your private practice. So head on over to pillarsofpractice.com to get access to this free e-course. Again, that's pillarsofpractice.com. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast with Joe Sanok, session number 924. I'm Joe Sanok, your host, and welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast, where we are helping you to build a thriving private practice and to also not lose the heart and the soul and the connection and all the things that you want to be a part of your business, to not lose that in the process. Those things that we learned in grad school, we often learned a lot of clinical things, but not a lot of the business, the marketing, the basic logistics, all those sorts of things. We didn't learn. And that's what we're here for, is to cover all sorts of different issues, whether they are clinical or marketing or business. And we just want to come alongside you. If you haven't signed up for our brand new course, it's called 40 Days to Full. So the idea is in 40 days that you will be as full as you want to be. And it's actually a course that's delivered via text message. So you just get a paragraph inspiration each day on what you need to do over a 40-day period of time to know, here's the exact next step I need to do in order to get full in 40 days. So all you have to do is text hashtag 40, so hashtag 40 to the phone number 231-422-0677, and you'll be signed up for the 40 days to full course, and you'll be rocking it out in the next 40 days. I'm so excited today because we're talking some clinical issues with Dr. Elisabeth Morray. Elisabeth is a licensed psychologist whose career has been grounded in her commitment to behavioral health practice, training, and leadership, along with applications of clinical skills and theories to the needs of diverse industries and populations, trained in evidence-based therapeutic modalities, specifically acceptance and commitment therapy and process-based therapy. She's practiced in medical, agency, and educational settings. And today we are going to be talking about the therapeutic relationship and psychological flexibility. Elisabeth, welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Thank you so much. It is such a delight to be here talking to you and to getting to share some of the things I'm most passionate about with your listeners. Thank you.
Yeah, I am really excited to talk about this. Now, psychological flexibility. Let's start there. How did you get into this? Before we started going with this recording, you had said some things kind of shifted for you from your early training. Maybe share with us some of your early training, and then what did that shift look like?
Yeah. Well, I think my interest in the therapeutic relationship and really thinking about how to promote that kind of connection really started quite early. And I trained at the Stone Center at Wellesley College, really looking at this relational cultural model that really kind of was some of the earliest research and clinical applications of this idea of the centrality of connection and mutuality in the therapeutic relationship as kind of a basis for what helps people change in therapy. But later on down the road, after I had already graduated and been licensed, I was introduced to acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. I did a training with Rhonda Merwin, who is the current president of the Association of Contextual and Behavioral Science, which is the parent organization that includes ACT. And I'll never forget being in her training and seeing in her real play this incredible, like, moment to moment presence that she embodied. And I began to wonder what tools she had access to in her work that my work might benefit from. And as it turns out, those tools were really mastery of these change processes that are at the core of ACT. So I remember at that point really wishing that I could go back to graduate school and relearn most of what I thought I knew about therapy. Um, my early experiences kind of led to what I describe as this like snooty indifference to behaviorism. I think in my mind, behaviorism was what was in the first chapter of your textbooks, right? Your clinical textbooks. Those like early approaches that were replaced by far more sophisticated therapies that allowed us to engage in the, in the complicated world of human experience, right? As opposed to behaviorism, which clearly in my mind was all about rats and cages.
Well,
So
let me just
my,
pause you right there. I went to
yeah.
Western Michigan University, which I mean, is purely behavioral in its undergrad program. So we had full on rat lab, and I mean, I was indoctrinated with so much of that behavioral psychology for sure.
Oh, I'm
So
jealous.
so anyway, didn't want to interrupt too much, but just had to throw that
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you that for a long time, I would hear a term like transformation of stimulus function or behavior under aversive control, and my brain would kind of explode. And I had no idea how those terms applied to the work that I was doing, right? Like, okay, that may apply to those rats, but did they apply to that person sitting in front of me crying? It didn't feel like that was really what was going on there. But I embarked on this ACT journey, and unfortunately, it did not involve going back to graduate school as much as I wished it might have. But I did have a chance to train with some of the real ACT masters: Steve Hayes, Robin Walzer, Kelly Wilson, with whom Rhonda Merwin had trained. Um, and I think to say that that has changed my way of thinking about the work I do as a therapist would really be a massive understatement. It's been truly transformative. Um, and I think one of the parts of the work that I do at Alma that I love most is having the opportunity to train other clinicians for whom, like, as it once did for me, behaviorism seemed really kind of arcane and irrelevant. And to kind of get past that language barrier and see how those tools can change their lives and their work, and probably most importantly, add to the therapeutic relationship. So, those were my earliest kind of forays into thinking about third wave behavioral therapies. And that has kind of evolved into thinking more broadly about process based approaches.
Now, Elizabeth, when you think about process-based approaches and psychological flexibility, like how do you bring all of this into the therapeutic relationship?
Yeah. I mean, I think historically, we have thought about therapeutic alliance as really being defined by establishing a sense of safety and trust and mutual agreement on what the kinds of things we're going to do in therapy and the goals we'll set with our client will be. And we have tons and tons of correlational research that indicates that those qualities are really important in terms of therapeutic outcomes. But I'm really curious about more recent research, particularly the work done by Hayes, Hoffman, and Shirochi, that actually goes a little bit deeper and looks at what is underneath those correlational relationships. And what they found is that, those qualities of alliance may actually be tied to psychological flexibility and mindfulness. That perhaps it's these skills that promote acceptance and mindfulness that allow us to create strong therapeutic alliances. So, to kind of simplify that a bit, therapeutic relationships that are supported by psychological flexibility are ones in which people can learn to be more open, aware, and really more actively engaged in their lives. And maybe even more importantly, people particularly benefit from working with a therapist who practices that exact same psychological flexibility and the processes that support it in their own lives and in their therapy sessions.
Mm. Now, for you personally, as you started to kind of grow in your education in psychological flexibility, actually, why don't we do some definition of terms? Because some people may not
Yeah.
know or even we may have different working understandings of how we apply some of these terms. So what would you say are, say, the 5 terms that in our discussion today we really need to make sure we're on the same page as we talk about?
Yeah. So when we talk about psychological flexibility, I think the traditional definition is that we are talking about being able to contact the present moment, what's showing up in our internal experience, like thoughts and feelings and memories, but also in our external context. So being able to contact that present moment consciously and fully, including all of the parts of our present moment that might be painful or unwanted. When doing that will allow us to identify the kinds of behaviors that'll move us in the direction of the values we choose. So I know that was a lot of words, but really, if we break that down, we're talking about these 6 core processes: acceptance, which is willingness to be in the presence of the kinds of unwanted things that make us want to run, fight, or hide, right? There are lots of thoughts, feelings, and memories that when they show up for us, we want to turn away from them. And what we know is that, unfortunately, running and fighting and hiding from things in our internal world rarely works, and can actually have some really significant costs in the long run. So we're thinking about acceptance. We're also thinking about our relationships with our minds, right? The language inside our heads, our thoughts, are often more real to us and have more impact on our behavior than anything that is literally physically in front of us in the moment, right? And so often these things in our minds that feel very real are things that we want to run, fight, or hide from. And so our behavior can be more about doing what works in terms of moving away from these internal experiences than it is about what's happening in the world around us. And so our relationship with our mind and changing that through a process that in ACT we call diffusion allows us to look at our thoughts and see them as they are and not look at what they say they are, right? Not take them so
Mm.
literally or hold them so tightly. And that gives us more freedom in terms of how we choose to respond to them. The third piece you'll hear mentioned there is mindfulness. So being able to contact the here and now. And then there's a component of kind of the way we think about ourselves. And, we all have lots of stories about who and what we are, and we tend to get really invested in those stories. So, part of what we teach people through these ACT processes is that they are not their thoughts, right? They are ultimately the consciousness that is able to notice this ever changing stream of thoughts, feelings, events. Um, and so when they change their relationship with those thoughts about who they are, ultimately they get to become more flexible in choosing how they respond.
Hmm.
And then finally, and probably most importantly, we talk about values and the kinds of behaviors that move us in the direction of what we value. And from an ACT perspective, values are really kind of freely chosen qualities of being that we wish to orient our lives around. And we talk about committed action as being those behaviors that allow us to move in the direction of what's most important to us. So it's hard to kind of describe all of this in a very succinct way, but hopefully I've broken it down a bit into these 6 primary components that we're going to be playing with and using both in terms of our clients' experiences, but also in terms of our own experiences in the therapy room.
Hmm. Hmm. And as you go through those, when I think about psychological flexibility, we're teaching our clients these things, or we're, working with them, helping them uncover their own truths, or however we want to frame it. Um, how important is it for a therapist to be doing their own work in those areas, even before they end up guiding?
That's such a great question. And I think, you know, part of the challenge is that in this relationship in which both people are showing up and influencing one another, um, as therapists, have ideally done some work to build our own psychological flexibility skills. And in my experience, this is less about having mastered any particular set of skills and more about having mastered the art of recognizing those moments in which our behavior as therapists and in our lives outside of the therapy room has become rigid or inflexible. Um, and noticing those as opportunities to practice a more flexible response. I think of it a little bit like a yoga practice. I know many people say that the power of a yoga practice is like falling out of a pose and returning to it again and again and again. And so when it comes to thinking about my own psychological flexibility, the thing I focus on the most is recognizing when I've fallen into rigidity and choosing to practice a different response instead, and then paying attention to what happens when I choose that different response. Is that something I want to continue that seems to move me in the direction of what's most important to me? Or does it not work as well? And so I need to be flexible enough to try something different. So, I think this is a practice that, as therapists, we as we show up to the relationship, we have the opportunity to model this to our clients, and we can only do that when we've done some of the work ourselves.
Mm. As a therapist, I can tell you from experience that having the right EHR is an absolute lifeline. I recommend using therapy notes. They make billing, scheduling, note taking, telehealth, and e prescribe incredibly easy. Best of all, they offer live telephone support that's available 7 days a week. You don't have to take my word for it. Do your own research and see for yourself. Therapy Notes is the #1 highest rated EHR system available today, with a 4.9 out of 5 stars on trustpilot.com and on Google. All you have to do is click the link below or type promo code Joe on their website over at therapynotes.com and receive a special 2-month trial absolutely free. Again, that's therapynotes.com and use promo code Joe on the website. If you're coming from another EHR, Therapy Notes will also import your demographic data quick and easy at no cost, so you can get started right away. Trust me, don't waste any more of your time and try Therapy Notes. Just use promo code Joe at checkout. Now, you mentioned yoga as an example. Are there other things that you would recommend is that work to be done on ourselves? And I know that's a broad question, and of course, there's a million different variations. But what are some of the ways that therapists can personally evaluate themselves to build that psychological flexibility, just so that they can be growing and then enter into that therapeutic relationship differently?
Well, I think there's a lot of talk these days about mindfulness, and a lot of people have begun to think about how they can intentionally practice a certain kind of attention, right? And that's what meditation is. It is intentionally training your attention. Um, Now, I wish I could sit here and tell you that I am an active meditator who has a practice that I adhere to. That's not yet true in my life. I hope one day it will be. But I have begun to think more about really paying attention to the times in my life where I am more caught up in my head, and in what is going on in my mind than what is happening right in front of me. And I mean, this is the beauty of being a therapist. I have the opportunity to practice that kind of skill multiple times in every single therapy session. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who has had one or maybe many of those moments of realizing that you are sitting there thinking about whether or not you remembered to take the meat out of the freezer so you can cook it for dinner tonight while your client is sharing some detail of their experience. Um, in therapy, our attention is constantly being pulled away. And that is not something that I think anyone will ever, quote unquote, overcome. But to the extent that we use that as an opportunity to practice our ability to bring ourselves back into the present moment, we're going to allow for some really kind of important opportunities for us to focus on what is happening in the moment, in the here and now, between us and our clients, and using that as a way to promote their learning in a way that I think really requires that kind of mindfulness.
Hmm. Well, what would be indicators that things are going well in a therapeutic relationship? Like, what would you say that maybe newer clinicians should look for?
Mhm.
And then I'd love for you to also speak to seasoned clinicians, because I do think that there can be an assumption, like I've been at this for a while, and maybe we let our guards down a little bit if we've been therapists for a while. So, like, what's a good strong therapeutic relationship look like for someone that's maybe earlier in their career, and then
Yeah.
for people that maybe are a little more seasoned?
Yeah. Well, I think really for both the more practiced clinician and someone earlier on in their career, I really encourage folks to think about the therapy hour as an opportunity to create in the moment learning, right? To see how we can use that time to create conditions in which our clients can learn more new, flexible behaviors right then and there with us as they prepare to practice them out in the world. Um, and I think what you'll see over the course of an effective therapy relationship is that you will often have to start with a tremendous amount of scaffolding to help your clients do things like paying attention to what is showing up in their emotions in that moment, right? Asking questions like, well, what's showing up for you right now? When their attention is more directed towards their thoughts than it is to their in the moment emotional experiences. Or actively kind of offering ways in which a client can adopt a different perspective, right? Initially, like when you're teaching someone to do anything new, you're going to be providing a lot of scaffolding and you're probably going to be doing a lot of modeling, right? Where you yourself, as the therapist, are practicing exactly those same behaviors. So I'll find myself frequently saying things like, oh, wow, I noticed my mind getting really active or really loud right there. I'm wondering what you noticed in that moment. Or things like, um, I'm having the thought that, right? So rather than looking through my thought, modeling the ways in which I am relating to my own thoughts in that moment. And so initially, you do a lot of scaffolding, you do a lot of modeling. And I think a therapeutic relationship is moving in the right direction when you have to do less and less of that with time. And this is no different than any kind of behavioral situations in which we're training a new behavior. Um, and so, after you've really built this relationship with a client, they can so easily engage with you in these activities in the present moment of noticing what shows up, including the stuff that shows up between the two of you that might be uncomfortable, that might actually represent some kind of rupture. And so when I supervise clinicians, often whom think that the first time there's a therapeutic impasse or a client gets angry at them or a client challenges them, that is an indication that things are going wrong or have gotten off course. I'll actually frame that as an indication that client feels comfortable and safe enough to give them very direct feedback, which is something that they are likely not familiar with being able to do in the outside world. And that from that perspective, right, you've created a context in which that is possible. And that is actually an indication that your client has done a lot of learning about what is possible for them in the therapeutic relationship. And your job as the therapist is to continue to build on the learning that is possible because of that kind of prior establishment of safety and trust and new skills in the relationship.
Mm. I think oftentimes what happens in the therapy sessions for the therapist and for the client is a microcosm of what's happening out in the world. How would you say for yourself or for the clinicians that partner with Alma or other therapists that I know your reach is broad, when they're having things come up in the sessions, when they're building that therapeutic alliance and psychological flexibility, like how is that affecting their lives outside of the clinical sessions?
For the client or for the therapist?
For the therapist.
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know that I've ever asked myself that. Um, I can tell you that in terms of like the days that I walk away and feel the greatest sense of kind of gratification and really kind of a sense of motivation, because I think, returning to a purely behavioral perspective, like when we behave in ways that align with our values, that's intrinsically reinforcing. We don't need a gold star or an award in those moments. Um, just behaving in ways that align with who and how we want to be as therapists and as people is in many ways going to be quite energizing. And so, I remind myself that at the end of the day, I am probably going to be most energized by the moments that are hard and the moments in which I do find myself shutting down or narrowing my own behaviors or getting kind of rigid in the relationship. If I've been able to use those moments as an opportunity to kind of pivot and move in the direction with my client, kind of in this dance that we do together of something different, of creating a context in which something other than that rigid behavior can occur. And so, I think there are ways in which, when I am most able to think about, openly think about and accept my own patterns of rigidity and my own particular challenges, I actually end up feeling more empowered and engaged on the other side of that. So I think when I made that shift, it went from being, having a hard session meant having a hard day, which meant having a hard life and being a worthless human being, to that very same hard session actually coming to represent an opportunity for me to do what I believe in most passionately, which is taking those moments of pain and suffering and rigidity and adding something to them in a way that opens up an opportunity for them to be transformed into learning or growth or meaning. So I would say, for both, I mean, I don't know that this is any less true for someone who's been doing this 40 years than it is for someone who's been doing this for. That, really reminding ourselves that to the extent that we are going to maintain our alignment with what is most important to us, that is going to mean being willing to show up and sit with the hard stuff, and that the hard stuff actually is probably most powerful in terms of our own growth and also our clients' growth.
So awesome. Elisabeth, the last question I always ask is, if every private practitioner in the world were listening right now, what would you want them to know?
I think one of the things that I've been learning very recently is to really think about the fact that everything you need to know about the client, everything, is available to you in the here and now, in the relationship, in the space between you and that client. And I think we often get caught up in wanting to construct this very detailed history of everything that client has experienced and how it got them to where they are now. I think we often get caught up in stories about who this client is and what it means to be working with someone who has had this label of borderline personality disorder attached to them. And I think I'm only now really fully being able to appreciate the fact that actually those more often than not detract from my ability to see what I need to see, which is exactly what's going on in the moment, in the space between me and this other human being who is suffering. And I found that to be incredibly empowering and incredibly challenging. And so I would encourage others who are interested in beginning to think that way, to just start paying attention to exactly what is happening in that moment, and imagining for a moment that everything they could possibly need in order to do a really good piece of work that would promote change and adaptation in this other human being sitting across from them is available to them right then and there.
So awesome. Well, if people want to connect with you, how can they do that? And also, can you tell us a little bit about Alma and how people can connect with Alma?
Absolutely. So in addition to being a therapist, the other hat that I get to wear is that I am VP of Clinical Operations for Alma. And I think the beauty of that part of my role is that for the first time in my career, I get to work with a group of people who are really embodying this idea that if we are thinking about the therapeutic relationship, including two people, the therapist and the client, or more people in different forms of therapy, but that we need to think about resourcing both people. We think a lot about what our clients need. I think in my experience, in other environments, we thought much less about what providers need in order to have the resources they need to be really effective in what they do. And so at Alma, we get to think about what these 16,000 providers we support need to make their lives easier, to give them the ability to really focus on that moment in the therapy session rather than worrying about the myriad of other things. And I know I'm preaching to the choir with you here. The myriad of other things that private practice therapists have to worry about and think about. And that, we as an organization get to step in and provide the resources that can then empower our clinicians to really show up fully for their clinical work in the way that they want to do. So I think, the progression of my career into the role I'm in now and supporting Alma and our providers has really been a very natural one and a very gratifying one.
Mm.
You can learn more about Alma at helloalma.com. And if you want to connect with me, LinkedIn is probably the best way, Elisabeth Morray. And I would love to continue the conversation with anyone who might be interested.
So wonderful. And thank you so much for being on the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Such a treat. Thank you so much.
There you have it. We love having these kind of conversations. If there are guests that you would love for us to interview, or people that would add to these types of conversations, feel free to email me, joe@practiceofthepractice.com. We each week get all sorts of people that pitch us on coming and being guests on the show, and we would love you, the audience, to make some introductions. Maybe there's people that you really respect that you feel like you could add to these conversations. We would love to consider having them on the show. And also, we couldn't do this show without our amazing sponsors. Today, Therapy Notes is our sponsor. Therapy Notes is the best electronic health records out there. If you want to learn more, you can use promo code JOE at checkout when you're at therapynotes.com, and then they'll know that their podcast sponsor dollars are working. Go check them out at therapynotes.com. And again, don't forget about that course, 40 Days to Full. We will be texting you every day for 40 days to help you fill up your practice. Just text #40, so #40 to the phone number 231-422-0677. Thank you so much for letting me into your ears and into your brain. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Special thanks to the band Silence is Sexy for that intro music, and this podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the producers, the publishers, or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or other professional information. If you want a professional, you should find one.